In the bright moonlight, Reed Lavender inserted his best crowbar into the pine box where the top met the sides and wrenched the steel down. Wood squeaked, and he shuddered. Worse than fingernails on a blackboard. He lifted the lid free, resting it against the freshly turned earth, which, unlike the sound of an opening coffin, was an almost pleasant thing. A pungent scent, but real. Honest. Worms and bugs, minerals and secrets lived in the earth. When you got right down to it, grave dirt wasn't really any different to regular dirt. And he was certainly down to it now, about to be elbow deep in a coffin. Again. But for what they had given Elise, the word coffin was a stretch. A pine box wasn't much of a final resting place. Dignity hardly came cheap in Rikerton's funeral home, and unclaimed bodies were lucky to avoid the incinerator. Or maybe that would have been better. Dust to dust and all that. But then you'd be out of work, he told himself. Elise, the runaway, that's what the police thought she was, lay in her dirty jeans and the same faded Pink Floyd t-shirt she wore when she walked into the cafe 2 days back. Her arms lay at her sides, cuts on her palms mostly hidden. Her face had been covered by a used napkin. Jesus, Jennings, that the best you could do? Reed growled. At least the napkin was in one piece. The undertaker had been known to be far more slipshod at times. Reed lifted the napkin and ground his teeth. She'd been beaten blue. Deep bruises swam across her cheeks, one eye swollen shut, and the other just as blackened, torn skin at her temple. Jennings had cleaned her face up well enough, but there were still leaf fragments and dried blood in her hair. The pallor of death had washed out Elise's freckles, mere suggestions crossing her bent nose. God, what was she? 15? She looked so small. Reed tossed the napkin aside and unwound his scarf, folded it and placed it over her face, standing still a moment, shaking as he blinked. The night air ran chill fingers across his now exposed throat and the back of his neck. Finally, he took a breath and leant over the coffin where he lifted her arm. Sorry, sweetheart, he said softly, twisting her silver bracelet up to the moon. Only the letters Elise engraved there. Really, there was little he could learn from a perfunctory glance at her clothing and jewelry that police wouldn't have already catalogued. He had checked that later, of course. But Elise deserved more. No, he'd have to wake her up. Sort of. Her last words would maybe be enough of a clue. Most folks didn't have much to say right before the end. Sometimes it was a scream or a grunt if he was unlucky. Other times they addressed their killer. Or a loved one, perhaps, if the death was peaceful. Not that I've heard a lot of those in my time. There'd been a man out west, he couldn't recall where, so many cities and towns blended together, whose last words had been an apology for burnt toast. After that, the poor guy hadn't said a thing before being T-boned at an intersection by a bus an hour later, 2 blocks from his office. But sometimes, a person's last sentence held a clue. Come on, Elise. Tell me something I can use. If she didn't, he had no other supernatural tricks up his sleeve either, since he couldn't simply call upon her spirit. It would have made things much easier and allowed him to stop violating people's graves. But sadly, he wasn't that lucky. Reed removed the scarf a moment, took her cold hands and closed his eyes, sending his awareness down through her mute fingertips, pushing his way along quiet veins until he reached her chest, still echoing with the memory of a million heartbeats. Then, at last, up the throat to the tongue which remembered everything. But it would move only once more. In the name of Moors, speak any that you might, he whispered. I'll help you if you can.